Hello and welcome. I'm Ronnie Kane, and this is How We Got Here, Episode 0, Consciousness Capture and the Slave Sovereign Axis. So, why am I doing this now? Well, early this year, my partner pissed on a stick, and we got the good news. I'm going to be a father, and we are going to bring a new life into this world. From that moment, I knew that among the millions of other implications coming with that new reality, the clock had started ticking for the time where education will come into question. Compulsory education. I knew that I had two choices. Confront that question myself or just ignore it entirely. And that latter option of ignoring it would leave me beholden to the norm, which is ultimately placing our children on what I call the compulsory conveyor belt of compliant consciousness conscripts, human uniformity, and standardization. That's something that, as you can probably tell from my wording, I'm not too fond of, unless I begin transmission of what I deem to be the correct frameworks of teaching and understanding that humans today are still starved of. I believe the lack of this foundational knowledge is largely responsible for the disorder of the world and its peoples, which is demonstrably getting worse. And as I explain in the introduction to my first book, the neurodiversity book, which I published a few months ago, I have personally felt failed by every institution and elder throughout my life. In particular, the educational system. So, why me? It's probably not until one is faced with parenthood that one comes face to face with the fact that, okay, I'm going to have to explain this and that and everything. You know, this is probably something that every other parent, a self-aware parent, realize that they are reflecting on everything. You know, you look out at everything when you realize you're going to be a parent and realize that at some point you're going to be asked, what the hell is this? So it's not because I think I'm smarter than teachers, but ultimately, if you don't do that, you teach children when they ask you things, they will have their senses made up for them by the machines and institutions, something that I'm going to get into within this lecture. So it's not that I think I'm smarter than teachers, it's because I can see the pattern of what education, along with our other institutions that govern and rule us today, have ultimately become, which is a consciousness management and humanity extraction system. So how do I plan on doing what I've set out to do here? Well, this series is my attempt to trace and outline how we got here, hence the title, how human consciousness became captured, managed, and farmed by systems that present themselves as solutions and salvation, and why most of us go along with it, the majority either without knowing, but completely complicit. And today I'll explain why my drive to do this series is not just paranoia and is rooted in real data of reality, ending with my personal perspective, as it stands today, on what the specific function and purpose of human consciousness actually is precisely, and of course why I think that. But first, a quick methodological disclaimer before I go any further. I'm not a professor, nor am I claiming to be some kind of hotshot polymath who should have his teachings listened to. I'm a philomath, a lover of learning. Now, I want to take us on a quick tangent here, which will be a helpful background to those who go on to listen to this next lecture that I do after this. So, the term philomath comes from the ancient Greek philos, meaning love, and manthenein, to learn. And this is the same root family that gives us mathematics, which in ancient Greek meant knowledge or that which is learned broadly, not just numerical calculation as we think of it today. And by Greek, I don't mean modern Greek, I'm referring to ancient Greek specifically, the language widely used from years 500 BC through to the early Common Era, which is the Indo-European family that English ultimately came from. And it's the language of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer, and typical ancient European philosophy, science, and also the New Testament. Because the ancient Greek language, known as Koine Greek, outside of Greece and Europe, was also the lingua franca, which is an important term that will serve to help us understand things as we go forward throughout this series. Which the lingua franca of ancient Greek was the common language used across different language groups for communication, trade, and administration across the Levant, Egypt, and other key places that are relevant in these upcoming early lectures. So it's important to understand this term lingua franca for something that is the essentially superseding language for the control apparatus behind an empire. Okay, but back to the actual thread of this lecture. right? So I'm a philomath, a lover of learning. So I'm not claiming to teach anything at all. I'm simply transmitting that which I've learned myself. All you'll ever hear from me is mere personal synthesis, pattern recognition across fields such as psychology, neuroscience, history, archaeology, religion and consciousness, noetic studies. Philosophy should be in there as well. That would make more sense. Now, the project itself, I'll always do my best to cite what I cite and to point out if something is just conjecture and whether its origins of that conjecture are from me personally or somewhere else. I'll always aim to show you explicitly the threads that I'm pulling. That is the whole point of this. This project is a projection of my personal ontology, meaning what I think is, and epistemology, why I'm convinced of that. And an example to help explain this idea of ontology and epistemology, I'm going to use this from Jung. When he replied when asked if he believes in God in one of his last interviews, "I don't believe, I know. The statement is ontological. God exists as part of his map of reality, and his epistemological method is experiential, phenomenological, internal, not belief." As he says, "I don't believe," as belief is accepting something without the direct knowing, which implies faith in others' claims. So what's the whole purpose, point and direction here? Okay, the purpose of this project is to compile and archive the history of human consciousness through the dissecting of human incoherence, for those who are lost and want to find the real thread themselves. So if anything resonates, please investigate it further. If anything doesn't, feel free to dismiss it. But regardless, the point is to think for yourself and develop your own sovereign consciousness here. Okay, so from episode 0, from here, we'll start tracking from the most obvious point on our timeline, which is what we call today and see today as year 0. Not because it's the beginning, it obviously wasn't, but because it's the hinge of this whole thing. So in the next lecture, after this one, episode 1, I'll explain the actual life behind the person we know today as Jesus Christ and why he was sovereignty incarnate. I'll then detail how imperial powers inverted his individual power and anti-religion teachings into a control system that could be globalized and utilized for the camouflaging and continuance of the fraternal factions behind the Roman Empire that are still indeed in charge now, not conspiratorial, but detail. And I'll eventually arrive at the present day, where the majority of humanity worship Abrahamic religions still. And I'll detail why that proves we're currently losing, quote, battle to slave consciousness. And after that, we'll then go way back to the civilisational reset humanity experienced circa 12,000 BC, and then through the great ages and cycles humanity has forgotten, where mainstream history and archaeology and consensus culture are too afraid to go, which explains our actual origins as humans. Ultimately, over the coming years, go where our institutions would never tread, but where our children must be walked, lest we continue this evil loop of distortion that perpetuates and accelerates at best disenchantment and disenfranchisement, and at worst, suicide, mental and physical illness, societal fallout, and civilizational collapse and erasure. But for now, if all this sounds like something you're interested in, then I'm deeply glad you found me. If you indeed have found this, and of course are also glad, please reach out to me personally so that we can connect and so that I can thank you for doing so. I sincerely hope you enjoy my work. And now, as they say, without further ado, we'll get into the body of this foundational episode, now its foundations are finished, and look at why exactly I've named this lecture Consciousness Capture and the Slave Sovereign Axis. Okay, so my old friend, institutional education. Now, children spend approximately 40% of their term time existence under institutional control, which is why I call it that. Well, and precisely why I call it that will make sense to you as you stick with me here. And across a full year, with holidays accounted for, and using a 12-hour waking day average across all ages for argument's sake, because of course you could make it 13 for whatever, but the point still stands here. They still spend over 28% of all waking hours in state-mandated institutions. And if you multiply that by 13 years, across the ages 5 to 18 that you must be in compulsory education for to get the whole picture. That is 16,055 hours, or just under 30% of their not asleep portion of their most developmental and plastic years of their life under institutional control. Now, you could just think, right, what's wrong with that? This is all fine, and just stop it here. But like I said, please stick with me, because the 28% figure is only a part of it. At home, 74% of couple families that have two parents, two people parenting in a guardian role, 74% of couple families now have both parents out working each day. Most children are spending almost all of their time outside of institutional education under algorithmic control by technology. The brutal truth is that parenting in the modern day is primarily being done by institutions and blue light stimulation, meaning our children are not being raised by families, they are being artificially processed by pre-designed systems. Generation Beta, this is the term being given to the cohort of people being born after the year 2025. Now, in the UK, children aged 5 to 16 as it stands average 6.3 hours of daily screen time. Well, that's from 2024. I imagine it actually increases per year, which is 44.1 hours per week and 2,300 hours per year, which is 96 full days annually spent staring at screens, which is 53% of their daily waking hours. And if you remember, the average school hours are around 6.5 per day, which is 54% of waking hours, making the combined school and screen time 107% of waking hours. Like I said, you can change the waking hour time from 12 to 13 to 14 to whatever, but it doesn't change too much the point that I'm illustrating here. Please excuse me, I've got a really obnoxiously loud cat that's screaming. Okay, I've addressed that. So this is not growth, it's formatting. For 11 to 14-year-olds, screen time averages around 9 hours a day, which is about 75% of their waking hours under algorithmic control. So childhood as an autonomous developmental space has been structurally eliminated. Our generations are being raised entirely within externally imposed processing loops with no gaps, developmental sovereignty, or time for the nervous system to build its own structures and rhythms. Humans are being formatted rather than grown, when we are like plants, but treated like machines. The new dual parenting. Our children are being parented not by parents, but by two hijacking processes. The first being during regulated hours, where institutional formatting provides behavioural conditioning and cognitive standardization, and the second being during what should be unstructured time, where algorithmic formatting provides constant external stimulation and direction through not just content consumption, but neurological interference from blue light stimulation, which humans used to get exclusively from the sun. Screens are not neutral tools. They're delivery mechanisms for dopamine manipulation, attention fragmentation, and the systematic prevention of boredom, which is precisely when internal processing and pattern recognition actually develop, if allowed to. So my kids' cohort will be the first to be born into a world where AI integration is native, meaning they can only know a world prior to its presence conceptually. Them, like my generation with smartphones and social media, I was born in the year 2000, regarding the knowledge of what the devil is that's being dealt with and all its implications, have been failed by our elders and institutions. The system we live in, or the devil we're in bed with, is self-reinforcing. Each generation becomes less self-aware and more dependent, making it harder for the next generation to transcend it or at least turn and face it. This is what's called a prisoner's dilemma, where parents of children in this system, pretty much most of them, feel unable to set boundaries with smartphones and social media as their kids report being isolated and excluded from the same world their peers operate within and navigate from. As group mammals, our worst punishment and worst fear is that of ostracization, of being ostracized from groups. This creates a prisoner's dilemma for parents, where individual parents can't solve the problem because it requires collective action. Most parents are required to be out of their child's way, working, which allows for their institutional capture because brainwashing can't happen if the parents are present. If you look at anything to do with brainwashing and any text psychology on brainwashing, the parents have to be absent. Makes sense, right? Leads to the prisoner's dilemma, which perpetuates the slave chain. Okay, so the trap is this. Choice 1. Parents who attempt to set boundaries with smartphones and social media face a choice between condemning their child to social isolation when peer culture operates entirely in digital spaces, and half of 11 to 16-year-olds find it easier to be themselves online than face-to-face, which is in a 2011 study, so we can only imagine that this has increased. And 3 in 5 11 to 16-year-olds say they would be lonely if they couldn't talk to friends via technology. Again, this is 2020. Soon to be 6 years ago. Choice 2. As the guardian to your young, surrender them to the second hijacking process of algorithmic control, which secures their occupation for 107% of their waking hours if we go on my argument's sake model. And it's safe to assume that this is what happens in almost every case. As 91% of UK children have smartphones by age 11, and age 11 is the age children start in secondary school. So this number will shoot up to around 100%, my prediction, by the time that they start their second year. Because this age 11 is only the age that they are starting secondary school. Why is this the perfect storm for slavery? Now, there's a perfect storm that's been created where the outcome is our children being raised by systems, not humans. Where institutional schooling, plus algorithmic hijacking, plus the economic coercion of parents' absence, leads to this harsh truth, where no individual parent can solve this without pulling their family out of society at some level. It's a collective action problem requiring system-level intervention, which simply will not happen because of some more harsh truths regarding said system. So the 3 systems-level intervention truths, whether they make us feel good or not. So why will intervention, so correct guardianship of our generations, something I'm sure if prompted we would all care about, at the systems level, so outside of the family unit, not happen? Because the economic pressure that forces both parents to work means they're barely present anyway. Harsh, but true. And institutions benefit from compliant, algorithmically pacified, and cognitively standardized children. Something they wouldn't overtly, explicitly state, but if you read between the lines, it's pretty much within all of the texts. And the system is self-reinforcing. Each generation's increased dependency and unique illnesses make intervention progressively harder and collective resistance increasingly impossible. Now, getting onto the dire data that we do nothing about. So why am I saying these systems are bad? Am I just having a go at schools? Well, they're only bad because the outcomes are not good. Okay, if the outcomes were anything but not good, my argument that the systems are bad would be null immediately. Okay, so they are only bad because the outcomes are not good. So what are the outcomes? Let's go there. Suicide is the leading cause of death for people aged 5 to 35 in England. Oh, this is very up-to-date statistic. 75%-ish, approximately 75% are boys, men. Higher suicide rates in young people receiving non-statement SEN support compared with those who receive no SEN provision. Now let me explain this. Non-statement special educational needs support means school level intervention. Okay, it doesn't mean officially or medically provided diagnosis and then roadmap or reasonable adjustments or anything like that. It means school level intervention. The suicide rates in young people that have received SEN support, school level intervention from schools, the suicide rates are higher than those who do not. So school level intervention is not only not doing anything good, but I'll leave it there. I'm sure you understand. And there are higher suicide rates for children in households where the adults have formal qualifications compared with households who do not. Now, you might need to read this bit a few times to make sense of how simple it is, how shocking it is. So in households where the adults have formal qualifications, the children have higher suicide rates in comparison with households where the adults do not have formal qualifications. So what good, aside from whatever, are the formal qualifications? Isn't that our North Star within society? So this leads me on to the false promise of, quote, education. In 2017, 1 in 9 children, so just over 10%, had a mental health difficulty. In 2020, this became 1 in 6, 16%. In 2023, this became 1 in 5, 20%. Again, that's 3 years ago. We can only assume what, especially with the trend line, where this is going. And 74% of teachers believe poor mental health is negatively impacting children's learning. And over half of teachers think they spend more time supporting pupils' mental health than actually teaching them. So let's continue this into higher education. Now, in the UK, over 69% of university students claim to be dealing with mental health issues as of 2024. The average student debt is £46,150, which takes on average 29 years and 4 months to repay. And for the average person, the interest grows faster than they can actually pay. And 44% are never able to fully repay, which means the debt follows them for 30 years before getting written off. And graduates now earn £1.43 for every £1 earned by minimum wage workers, which is down from a 2-to-1 ratio in 2007. So the pathway con. More than 1/3 of UK graduates are underemployed. 78% of students consider leaving university during their studies. 48% of recent graduates of the past 5 years regret going to university entirely, and 44% say that they don't need their degree for their current job. And when looking back, 52% of UK graduates completely regret their decision. So why is suicide a choice that people choose? Suicide as sovereignty sickness. When the realization occurs that you were wrong to trust the system and ended up a slave to tyranny in return for promised outcomes you either didn't get or did not like, you feel too far gone, making any idea of course correcting feel so out of reach that your last sovereign decision as a human is to stop being one. Proving that in all their years as a human, they weren't able to develop into what that should have meant. Suicide is the ultimate symptom of a captured consciousness recognizing its capture, but seeing no escape route except terminal exit. Because as a society, we do not develop sovereign humans. We format, process, and extract their consciousness on their behalf without teaching them what it is. The systematic harvesting of human attention and the external processing of identity formation. This data reveals something far more totalizing than the reductionist conclusions of screen addiction in kids these days, or an education crisis for kids these days. It documents the complete capture of consciousness during its most formative and plastic period. Now, let me detail the consciousness capture framework. The systematic initial capture and embedded control of attention, cognitive development, and identity formation through the convergence of 1. State-mandated institutional processing. Remember, 28% of childhood waking life. 2. Algorithmic behavioural and neurological modification. 50 to 75% of daily waking hours. If we're lucky, really, because it's much more than that. And economic coercion, removing parental presence, with 75% dual income necessity. Children can only be brainwashed if away from their parents, remember. And the social coordination traps that prevent escape or course correction, with peer culture entirely digitized and the fear of ostracization. So what are the results of total capture? Well, if total capture is 107% of young people's waking existence under institutional and algorithmic control during their most neurologically plastic years, what are the results? Dopaminergic pathway hijacking, external dependency for motivation and direction, loss of personal locus of control through externalization and no ability for self-authorship. The default mode network being suppressed, leading to identity consolidation never properly developing due to no boredom and rest states for it to, and the loss of internal narrative generation and the ability to sustain autonomous thought. And prefrontal cortex dysregulation, which comes with executive function impairment, the inability to self-control, and the loss of decision-making abilities as you're not required thanks to years of externally provided direction, and the always-on stimulation of novelty intake and task switching. So the ultimate irony is that this consciousness capture system, with its industrial aims of standardization, creates precisely the same neurological patterns that it labels as neurodevelopmental disorders, and the rise in their diagnosis as an epidemic. The ultimate irony. The more the system tries to format round pegs, the decided order, the more square pegs, the disordered, it produces. So the system is ultimately manufacturing more of what it defines as dysfunction while attempting to create uniformity. The ordered order then is producing increasing disorder, which in an ironic twist is proving the order itself is disordered. The canaries in the coal mine. The rising neurodevelopmental crisis isn't more disorders. It's more visibility of what the system is doing and does to all children. The neurodivergent are the canaries in the coal mine in 3 simultaneous ways. Firstly, being the natural innate resistance, when they reject the formatting from the start, the square pegs refusing to be rounded. The second, the visible damage. They show the neurological harm from capture more obviously than neurotypical children, more compliant, who successfully suppress symptoms and appropriate normalcy more appropriately. And that they are the early casualties. They are the first to break under a system that's breaking everyone, just some more slowly than others, which is proven by the rise in diagnosis and neurodevelopmental conditions for people aged 30 and above. I speak about this in the other work that I do. So industrialized consciousness farming, that's what we're dealing with here. These are not fragmented problems requiring fragmented solutions. This is the industrialized farming of human consciousness by a system that captures the raw material of children's attention and neurological development through compulsory institutional attendance and unavoidable digital dependency, with punishments if you don't comply, and processes it through standardized mechanisms of uniform curriculum, expected normalcy, and algorithmic recommendation engines designed for compliance and consumption, not sovereignty or coherence. And they extract economic value with university debt servitude, credential inflations, and precarious employment all the while transferring at the same time risk, with fear that comes with it, entirely to the individual, which produces broken outputs, with 1 in 5 with mental health difficulties, suicide as the leading cause of death, and graduate regret of 52%, underemployment over a third, because the system was never designed to produce healthy sovereign humans, but to produce compliant standardized economic units for industrialization and military conscription. Lastly, this reinforces itself generationally through coordination and coercion traps that make individual escape impossible without social exile, while each generation's increased dependency makes the next generation's capture more total and resistance more helpless and stigmatized. You know, we all have experienced this thing from prior generations of, well, it was tough for us. So why am I calling it consciousness capture? Because it names the resource being extracted of attention, neurological development, identity formation, and the capacity and ability for sovereignty at scale. And it names the systemic mechanisms doing the extraction of institutional and algorithmic control. In a consciousness universe that we exist and operate in, and before we, this isn't any argument of quantum physics or is consciousness fundamental or not. You can disagree. It's not any of that. It's the fact that as humans, we are inherently conscious of our existence. Okay, so that's what I mean by that we exist and navigate and operate within a universe that we are inherently conscious of. So in a consciousness universe, the primary resource then for an economic control empire requiring slavery to exist is not just labor as it used to be. It used to be slave labor. The ultimate resource is consciousness itself and our attention. So the reason I say consciousness capture and not mental health crisis is because mental health crisis treats symptoms as disease while distracting from the cause of those symptoms. The reason I say consciousness capture and not technology problem is because technology problem implies personal choice, distracting from the systemic sovereignty impairment. The reason I say consciousness capture and not education reform is because education reform assumes the Victorian institutions that we have today can indeed be fixed, distracting from their primary function being capture in the first place. And the reason I call it consciousness capture and not parenting failure is because parenting failure ignores the fact that parents are forced to comply with states parenting. So an important concept here is this tyrant-slave dynamic. The ultimate representation of slavery is consumption, as in order to leave the land of a tyrant, you must first refuse all that they offer you to stay. Now, we only need to think about the story of Exodus here, with Moses leading the Israelites away from the Pharaoh and having to deal with, for as many years as they kept repeating, I think the number was 40, the Israelites' complaints, constant complaints. You only need to study this text to understand this, the constant complaints from the Israelites, because they were all of a sudden without that which the Pharaoh was indeed providing them. So the ultimate manifestation of slavery perfected, is consumption. Now, the opposite to leadership by tyranny is leadership by invitation. But systems of tyranny do not invite, they force compliance one way or another, but typically through fear and force. And you might see this as something that you might be familiar with. Okay, so tyrants tend to say things like, the apocalypse is coming, the end is coming, the bad thing is coming, and we should do everything, including control you and everything that you do because of that. You know, this is why we have wars, so that they can say this. The ultimate indictment is that our children are not being raised, they're being processed, and that consciousness is not being developed, it's being captured. And that this is not education. Our educational institutions are not about education. They are industrialized identity formation for economic extraction. And that career pathways and concepts of employability are complete cons. It's standardization formatting for predictability at scale. And the outputs of people being personally broken, mentally unstable, financially indebted, professionally precarious young adults, that's not system failure. In fact, it's system success. It's to convey about working as intended for dependency and reliance. Now, this concept of inherited and unexamined is a key takeaway here. So none of this data highlights problems that need solving by a government or by the institutions themselves, as that is just continued externalization of agency. If the institutions themselves were able to fix this, they would have already. And regarding the government, what are politicians other than employees of a deep state, for lack of a better word, but by that I mean the industrial and military lobbyist complex, which is really in charge. What are politicians other than employees that we pay for, that enter and exit on a revolving 4-year democratic door, that decide for themselves the projects that they are going to work on, with no accountability or transparency on those projects? And oh, would you believe it, by the time their tenure is up, they haven't actually completed a single thing. Remember, it's not the people who vote that count, but the people who count the votes. So this data does not highlight problems that need solving by a government or by the institutions themselves. Instead, this all shows, in crystal clear definition, a regime requiring our recognition and resistance. Everything in this universe is inherently neutral, and the world exists for good. But good has to be chosen, and its opposite fundamentally rejected, at the individual level. Evil thrives and grows where that which is inherited is also unexamined. Inherited and unexamined. Ponder that yourself, within your own life, that which is inherited and unexamined. And in the world, that which is inherited and unexamined. The wars, the conflicts, all of this that is just tribal nature still being projected from some past trauma. It's all inherited and unexamined. Why can't one generation just wake up at some pocket in the world, let's say, and think, why are we doing this? But that would be examining it. Why are we doing this? That is examining it. So the game we're really playing, that I'm led to be convinced, is what the ancients would call an eternal battle between two polarizing forces. Whether you want to call it light versus dark, good versus evil, or truth versus distortion, I'm led to be convinced that it's real. Which would then make coherence versus incoherence in one's individual and ultimately the collective ontology the difference between a healthy or corrupt internal substrate, and it's that which leads to either a healthy or unhealthy world. And the definition of consciousness is awareness with a choice. Therefore, the specific experience we are all here to participate in is a game of slave consciousness versus sovereign consciousness. A slave consciousness would be us externalizing our awareness and ability to choose. And sovereign consciousness would be us embodying our innate abilities to be aware and to make choices and to actually make them. So the only real teachings here are, if the highest individual resource in a consciousness system is not human labor but the human spirit, which is our individual human nature itself, divinity, our individual divinity, if you want to call it that, and consciousness is awareness with a choice, something we all start with the capacity for, then being aware and able to choose is paramount, and are therefore the two things that will always be most meddled with by system control actors: our ability to be aware and our ability to choose. And that thinking for yourself and questioning everything is key. And to face your life with eyes wide open, even and especially when it hurts to do so. And that our only actual job is to choose good and love at every crossroads. And good and love are essentially the same thing.